The International Labour Organization says young people are the worst affected by the coronavirus pandemic as they're losing jobs at a higher pace. The ILO says the prospects for the second quarter of 2020 remain dire, with the latest ILO estimating a decline in working hours of around 10.7% relative to the last quarter of 2019. Now, this equals 305 million full-time jobs when assuming a 48-hour working week. Newzroom Afrika business editor Xolani Mbanjwa now joins us live. A very good afternoon, rather. Thank you for joining us. I mean, you're speaking, you're listening on that International Labour Organization, just speaking about the effects of the youth. I mean, if we look at the African continent, the majority is the youth. This obviously begs question to the future and what the situation is going to amount to for them. What's emerged on other fronts?
It's actually quite interesting that Africa is third on the list, Liezle, when it comes to the regions that are most affected, when it comes to youths who are going to lose jobs and who may lose jobs permanently. So Europe and Americas lead the tally of the jobs that are going to be lost, the jobs that are actually being lost. And when you look at all the jobs that are being lost around the world, it's actually the youth and particularly women who are actually, facing the brunt of the job losses as a result of COVID-19. But I caught up with the director of the International Labour Organization, Dr. Xolani Mbanjwa, and he's saying that the most important thing right now is that we need to develop policies as countries around the world that are going to absorb these particular jobs, because now employers are not going to many employ these young people back. They would rather go to mechanization and technology, taking up those spaces because you don't have to pay them. Let's take a listen to what Dr. Mbanjwa has to say.
When we talk about the world of work, with a particular focus on young people, the picture is particularly dire. We find that globally, 1 in 5 young people who were working at the beginning of this year have now lost their jobs. And that we must put in the context of an already very high youth unemployment rate. We know that if we take the example of South Africa, unemployment is standing around 29–30% before COVID. But now, for young people, we know that the official figure was already around 54%, with some experts saying it's probably upwards of 60–70%. With COVID, this situation, which was already a crisis of momentous proportion, has now become that much worse. And in this regard, that young people are the first ones to lose their jobs, and not only that, that they are also the ones who have not lost their jobs but are seeing their working hours cut and their income also cut. That is particularly difficult. But when we look at young men versus young women, the situation is even more dire for young women. And therefore, the gender dimensions of the impact of COVID on young people is something that we also have to look at. Women are occupying work areas that are lower down the hierarchy, and so many people talk about a pyramid shape where you have the majority of the women at the lower end, and the numbers become much less as you go up.
What has led to that higher than expected increase in Europe and the Americas when it comes to young people in particular being impacted?
We realize on the African continent that the primary sectors, the extractive sectors, and agriculture is where the majority of our people are. And services has in the recent past now been increasingly contributing a much greater number of people, particularly young people. But it is increasing the employment numbers in areas where there is already fairly poor employment conditions. They are largely in informal economy, or they are in informal employment relationships, even if they may be in formal enterprises. And therefore, you find that young people are 70–75% in Africa likely to be in the informal economy, whereas the global average of young people being in the informal economy is much lower. And given the impact of COVID on the informal economy, therefore the disproportionate impact on young people is therefore felt on the African economy.
What is it that's, that we are seeing that companies are actually doing or are likely to do once the lockdown restrictions are actually lifted?
This is the question of our time. How are we going to handle the youth dividend so that it does become a dividend and not a burden? And indeed, COVID-19 has exacerbated what were already policy and structural weaknesses in the past. So in one respect, you could say COVID-19 is making worse a situation that was already very bad, if at all that is possible. And in this regard, the onus in the first place is with the state. And when enterprises respond, they are waiting for policy signals from the government. And you have to say, some governments have been visionary in putting in place employment-intensive programs, employment-intensive guarantees. We have seen, for example, in this country, the tax incentive scheme, incentives to enterprises to employ young people. If those were necessary in the past, post-COVID, these are going to become even more critical so that young people can get a chance to enter the world of work. We have seen also training guarantee schemes, because young people are coming with basic skills. They now need to be shaped into, let's say, highly productive workers in the enterprises, and therefore training and training schemes become particularly key. So these policy measures from the state are going to become very critical in the measures post-COVID to make what others, our Director General has called a better normal, rather than the previous normal, which was already an unfair normal for a lot of the young people. But there is an issue that needs to be factored here, and that is the importance of dealing with automation and digitalization, mechanization, because probably those are the forces. Technology is driving the automation of processes that before were at the lower end, and therefore young people coming into the labor market for the first time could find this type of jobs. But automation, one would dare postulate, is now going to be even at a much faster pace with the impact of COVID. So enterprises may have a choice between older workers, younger workers, or a machine. And experience is showing us, in the first place, more and more enterprises are choosing, in the first place, a machine.